Good afternoon. My name is Marisa Demaya, and I am with the Southwest ADA Center here in Houston. I will be serving as co-presenter and moderator today, along with my two colleagues, Debby Jones and Diego Demaya. We'll be providing some good discussion, hopefully, and spend what we hope is a fun, entertaining, and informative lunch hour with you guys. Very briefly, some housekeeping, and forgive me, I forgot to include our slides in there, but if anyone is joining us via the telephone today, if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand by hitting *9, and that will prompt. I will certainly give you cues throughout the presentation, but you can hit *9 if you'd like to raise your hand when it comes time for some Q&A. For anyone else, you can either submit your questions using the Q&A button. We will be looking at the chat, but I would encourage you to please use the Q&A so we can keep better track of those questions, and we'll stop in between to address them. We are providing ASL interpreters today for our program, as well as captioning is available. You might need to hit that More button with the three little buttons on your controls to activate those captions. You might need to hit it twice to hit Show or Hide Subtitle. And very briefly before I get started, I'm going to introduce Debby Jones, who is an ADA Center guru, and Diego Demaya, our other guru, joining me today, and I want to thank them. You guys want to say something really quick?
Yeah, hi guys, I'm Debbie. Welcome. Happy to be here with you guys today.
Well, hello there. This is Diego, and welcome to the show.
All right. Thanks for sharing your lunch hour with us, guys. I'm going to go ahead and dive in. So to give you just a little bit of premise, we're going to be talking about service animals in the workplace. But just to give you a bit of background, we've thrown up here the 5 titles of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I, of course, deals with employment, prohibits disability discrimination in all employment processes. Title II pertains to accessibility of our public entities, that's your state and local government, and encompasses your physical and program accessibilities in all of those processes and services. Title III deals with accessibility in public accommodations or businesses. That's your general commerce, your restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, retail stores. Title IV deals with your telecommunications, of course, that's your telephone and communication systems for the public. And then Title V deals with more miscellaneous issues, such as protections from retaliation. Did I miss anything, guys? Diego, Debbie?
No, you're good.
No, you're good.
All right, so for the main discussion of today, we've starred there Title I because that's really what we're going to be focusing on and how this ties into employment. So who's got rights under the ADA? Well, in general, the ADA applies to people who have a disability, have a record of or are regarded as having a disability, or may have an association with a person who has a disability. That could be a family member, or perhaps they're a caregiver of someone. So we've also thrown in here, what is a disability? Of course, I'm sure you've heard this a few times, but it's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And We're not going to go into that too much. The list is really non-exhaustive, but if you have questions about that later on or would like to contact us to talk about that a little bit more, we're certainly happy to talk with you about it at the ADA Center. Moving on, revisiting some of Title I here. Basically, Title I, to give you some more background, covers employment and applies to your private employers with 15 or more employees, state and local governments, of course, and includes your employment agencies, as well as labor unions. Some state and local laws may require employers to provide reasonable accommodations when they have fewer employees. We thought that was good to note that in there. Title I ensures that these covered entities do not discriminate against individuals with disabilities. And of course, this applies to all those facets related, such as your job application procedures, hiring and firing processes, advancement, or as I mentioned a minute ago, discharge of employees. It also includes workers' compensation, job training, and other possible terms and conditions or privileges of employment. All right, moving on. Title I allows for reasonable accommodations, or what are known as adjustments to an employee's performing their essential job functions. And we'll get to talking about that a little bit more in terms of this context. But essentially, reasonable accommodations allow also for certain defenses on an employer's behalf, such as undue hardship, fundamental alteration, or direct threat.
So if I can sort of butt in,
Yes,
certain
please.
defenses, to me, the word defenses might be a little bit confusing. It took me a minute when I looked at it, but is this a way for an employer to decline to provide an accommodation that an employee requested because that accommodation would present itself as an undue hardship, a fundamental alteration, or a direct threat?
In essence, yes. However, I think as Diego would probably or will probably jump in here and inform, it doesn't necessarily get the employer out of the obligation of providing accommodations or essentially seeing what if other accommodations might be provided.
Yeah, that's correct, Marisa. So no one, I mean, employers are not exempt from, considering the requested accommodation. They would be required to engage interactively, which I know you haven't mentioned yet, um, with the employee to uh, identify other possible alternative accommodations that might, that might allow the individual to perform their essential job functions. So I think it's important to note that the ADA law does not promise the best accommodations, right? Or somebody's preferred accommodations. It only promises what is appropriate in order for them to do their job, perform their job functions, job duties. And that would include thinking about what marginal functions of the job, for instance, parts of the job that are not that important or as important as essential functions that could be done away with so that the individual can perform their essential job functions rather than having to focus too much or waste too much time, doing functional things like I don't know, like loading reams of paper onto a copier or something like that, which may not be a primary function of their job. So just, you know, this can get kind of, complex and we could talk for hours about it, but I'll let Marisa continue. But that's just the idea that employers basically have to continue to consider accommodations. They can't just say, no, we're not going to accommodate you and let's move on. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Debbie, for pointing that out. All right. So again, what's a reasonable accommodation here? We've thrown this up here. Any change to the application or hiring process, as mentioned, might be a little bit redundant here because we've already discussed this a bit, but basically a change to the work environment, to the way the job is done, such as modification of duties, and allows a person with a disability who is qualified for them to perform the job and to enjoy equal employment opportunities to perform those essential functions of that job. And as we talked about just a minute ago, in order to determine what's reasonable, an employer must carefully consider a request by an employee or applicant with a disability. Now, getting into service animals and how this ties into everything. We've thrown up the definition up here of service animal under the ADA. Of course, a service animal is any dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. In rare cases, it may be a miniature horse that maybe also serve as the service animal. So what helps make the determination if a disability is not obvious? Of course, there's the two questions that somebody can ask a person with a service animal in terms of if they're going into like a public facility or public accommodation. Those two questions are, number one, is the animal required because of a disability? Not what is your disability? And then number two, what task or service does the animal perform for you? So, clarifications here about service animals in the workplace. There is a definition of service animals in specific guidelines in parts of the ADA, but not in the part that deals with employment. And we're making that clarification, just so it's understood that under Title I, there's no definition of service animals and no specific really guidelines for employers to follow when an employee asks to bring their service animal to work. And basically, we're just saying that it's based on that definition of the ADA, under the ADA. So different states may have varying or broadened definitions of service animals. They may refer to a service animal as an assistance animal. It may include emotional support and comfort animals under this same umbrella definition of assistance animals. Different states also may include that under that umbrella service animals in training. So some common misconceptions is that there's no quote certification or service animal registry anywhere in the United States in the law. We often hear this at the ADA Center. We'll get phone calls, usually from a public entity or in a public accommodation, sometimes inquiring about that, about whether or not they have a certificate as to the genuineness, right, of the service animal. And that's basically not true. There is no registry. Sometimes people misguidedly or unfortunately fall prey to some online misguidance that offers to provide them with a certificate and whatnot, and that is simply not the case. And unfortunately, we inform a lot of people daily that if you paid a fee to get a certificate or some type of thing that says Fido is registered, that's just simply not true. Breed restrictions. This is also a big one. We get a lot of questions about this to the ADA Center as well. Breed restrictions do not apply to service dogs. We have seen it and heard it all. in terms of service dogs. I've seen pit bulls. I have seen Rottweilers, Doberman Pinschers. I've seen smaller breed dogs like Chihuahuas. They do exist. So there's no breed distinction with regard to service dogs. They are not required to wear a vest or a harness or specific patches. That is also a common misconception, is that somebody says, well, shouldn't they be wearing XYZ? That's, again, simply not the case. We get that as another pretty common question. And in terms of employment, employers cannot decline somebody to have their service dog accompany them at work on the basis simply of insurance. Or what we tend to hear sometimes is, well, we can't let you have the dog accompany you because it'll make our insurance go up, or because we have issues with insurance. I mean, what if the dog were to bite someone, etc. Again, a lot of that is based on just some, very incorrect assumptions there. That's really not a valid excuse for denying someone's request. And we'll get into that a little bit further here soon. So employers are indeed allowed to ask questions about a person's disability in relation to the need for the request to have the service dog at work. We know earlier we said that, when someone's asking the two questions, right, about what a dog does for the person, we always, try to caution people against asking directly what somebody's disability is if it's not obvious. But in the case of employment, it's a little bit different with regard to the employer. If the employer gets a request from somebody to be accompanied by their service dog at work, then they certainly do have, the right to ask certain questions regarding a person's need. Again, it's regarding the person's need in relation to having the dog at work, how it's going to help them perform their essential job functions at work, right? Anybody else want to weigh in here before I move on?
No, you're doing good so far.
Okay.
Yeah, this is great. I think for a lot of people with service animals, part of the problem is not that they don't know all of this, but that people they encounter don't know this. And I know it can be an ongoing frustration for some folks with service animals.
Absolutely. Additional points that we're making here, of course, this is some that really kind of goes to just general etiquette. But again, when someone has a service animal in the workplace, as in public, they must remain on a leash or tethered to the person somehow, unless the task or service they're performing for the person would require the dog to be off leash. And there may be some instances where that might occur, depending on the disability or their needs. They must be under the handler's control at all times. So they can't be running up and down the halls or barking at folks or behaving aggressively. Those are simply not things that needs to be allowed, and usually not something that you see of service dog behavior in general. They're usually trained, or were for the most part trained to not behave in such manners. But again, they got to be under the handler's control at all times. The dog cannot sit on the chairs or the table or other surfaces like that in public places, right? And the owners must follow all city or state laws with respect to vaccinations. And that's a valid thing. Employers can inquire about, some limited documentation with respect to that, with regard to the service dog. Limited documentation may be requested in certain settings with regard to the employee's need for the dog, again, if it's not obvious. But this also applies in, these other settings such as housing, transportation providers, and of course, employment. So here comes the $1 million question, right? Can you bring a service animal to work? Well, you can, and we've got a picture of Steve Carell here in a screen cap from the old show, The Office. Um, you can bring a service dog to work. The question is, are you allowed to? And the short answer here is, well, it depends, right? Maybe. Um, Under Title I, service animals are considered to be a reasonable accommodation in the workplace. So that being said, just as anybody would follow that process, an employee must request that the service animal be present as an accommodation for their disability. So they would need to submit that request. It's not as easy as just walking in one day and saying, hey, I've got my service dog with me all of a sudden. It's not quite that simple, right? Considerations for employers. So a person may request to have their service animal or emotional support animal accompany them as an accommodation to perform their work functions. As we talked about a little bit earlier, the employer should then engage in the interactive process to help them understand how that service animal would help the employee perform those essential job functions. And that's really what we're getting at, the nitty-gritty of it.
Marissa.
So, yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of offer a quick comment or observation about um, the reasonable accommodation process in terms of asking for or asking to be accompanied, to be allowed to be accompanied by a service animal at work. And I wanted to mention that there might be a couple of exceptions where the accommodation would almost be granted or should almost be granted by default. And that would be in the case of a blind person who uses a guide dog, right? Because I think that we're all aware by now that guide dogs serve it's a personal, basically guiding function, kind of like people using a wheelchair, or, well, quite simply, people, wearing glasses to read. So the guide dog for a blind person would, should be allowed to accompany the person to come to work. And that's regardless of the type of work environment. Um, the only caution there, right? The only caveat there would be that there might be certain work environments where a blind person has been known to be working, that where the dog may not be permissible because of health related um, regulations or um, in regards to safety and risk and the safety of the dog. And so there would be some interactive process there involved in deciding whether or not the guide dog for a blind person could remain. And that would be the same thing. That would also apply to someone who's using a hearing dog. A deaf person using a hearing dog would have the same type of, you know, accommodation almost by default. I don't want to say by default because, there's always questions that need to be asked and answered in regards to the work environment and the necessity of the dog to be there. So um, we've come close to seeing this also with regards to people who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders. Um, but then again, that would be part of the interactive process, and the type of PTSD would need to be discussed so that the employer can understand why the dog would have to be present or next to the individual, accompanying them while they're working for an entire day. So I just kind of wanted to kind of mention that, there might be some exceptions there, but for the most part, what Marissa said is entirely correct. And that is that anytime anyone, including a blind person or a deaf person, um, or hearing impaired person who uses a hearing dog, anytime they ask for to come in to work with their service animal, there will be an interactive process that needs to take place before the employer can approve that. Okay.
Great. Thank you for weighing in. That's really good to point out. You know, and the other thing is sometimes we get calls to the center, you know, where somebody might be responding. You know, sometimes I call it the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, they're asking me why I need the dog, or they're asking me about my disability. You know, and we do have to tell folks, well, yes, they're entitled to ask you some questions about your need for having the dog there if it's not obvious. And then there's some silly callers that we get when it is obvious, right? That they need the dog for those very reasons Diego just mentioned. So it always just depends. All right, other considerations we've mentioned here um, with regard to employers is whether the animal affects the employee's ability to perform those essential job functions. Now, I made a comment just a minute ago about the employer is entitled to ask you questions about your need for the dog. The other thing here is that, you know, remember it's got to be to do with those essential job functions. How is the dog helping you to be able to be there and perform those job functions? So it does need to be according to what business necessity, right, Diego, right, Debbie?
That's correct. Yeah, it's always the business necessity thing.
Yeah. So again, you know, sometimes they might ask you a question if, you know, it might seem inappropriate. And I always tell people if it seems inappropriate to you, then do speak up and let the employer know that you know, well, why do you need to know about that? You can ask questions too. So it does go both ways. We always try to recommend that to people that, you know, that's why it's called the interactive process, right? If you're getting questions, but sometimes you might get a question that might not seem appropriate. And it's always important to go back to the employer and ask, why are you asking that? Or what do you need that information for? As Diego mentioned earlier, safety concerns and restrictions sometimes might apply in terms of the decision for the employer whether or not to allow the dog. You know, another example we've got is somebody may be working in a chemical lab or possibly a kitchen. You know, I have heard of service dogs though, working, you know, accompanying their handler if they're working in a kitchen. There are ways to sometimes, you know, have a possible workaround. Again, it's going to depend on the environment and the employer. Allergies, you know, we've thrown that up here too. They're considering possible impacts on the general work environment. You know, it's never, sometimes people make comments, right? When somebody comes in with a request and they say, well, we'd have to tell everybody else why you need the dog. Not so fast, right? Not quite. But, you know, they might say, well, what about, you know, people who have allergies? We've got somebody who's really allergic to dogs. Well, you know, it the way it works, folks, is that they would have to accommodate or try to figure out a way to see if they can accommodate both parties. Because one person's accommodation needs certainly don't trump another's, right? You have to consider both employees' needs and the impact to both employees and the work environment. Vaccination status, we already talked about that. They can certainly ask for that information in terms of documentation. All right, we've thrown up some useful resources here with regards to, and there's a lot of there's a lot of them up here. I did want to take a moment to just remind folks, I put it in the chat earlier, but we will send you a copy of today's presentation so you don't have to scramble here to write notes down or anything. And of course, our presentation's being recorded, but you will get a copy of this presentation after today's program, okay? These are just some of the things that we've thrown up here. So a couple of things we've I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Is there was an NPR story that was done back in 2020, and if you are on, if you do follow this person, this lady is also on X, formerly known as Twitter. She works in a lab, and she brings her service dog with her, who accompanies her. She talks daily about and is very open about the whole process that she has gone through with her employer to try to accommodate her and her need for the dog. There we've got a picture of the screenshot here with her service dog, who is actually wearing some safety goggles. And that's actually legitimate. I don't think they didn't just dress the dog up, to be honest with you. It's pretty cool.
They're
Um,
doggles.
yeah, doggles. There you go. I
Yeah.
love it. Um, so that we put
I'm
that
going to
in
start
there.
saying that I'm wearing my doggles. I like that.
Right. So essentially, we thought this was a really cool example to kind of throw in there in case anybody was interested or has listened to this. It's pretty cool. We put the link in there. Another one was the lawsuit that we've heard a bit about throughout the year. It started in, I think the lawsuit was filed in 2022, and then finally last year, right, Diego, they came to a settlement agreement. This was the case about a truck driver who needed to have the service dog with him in the truck, and then they didn't want to allow him to have the dog in the truck for, I think they made several different types of excuses, but that's actually a screenshot we put in there of the truck driver's German Shepherd dog. I think he
Yeah,
calls it
that's
Rift.
a good picture. Yeah, right. Yeah,
Anyway, we put that in there. Do you
it
want to
was a
talk?
really good case. Yeah.
Do you want to
Oh
talk
yeah,
about this a little bit?
yeah. Just kind of quickly to contrast with one where the dog was not allowed, which I don't think we have. We should have looked it up and put it up, but I forgot to mention it to you. By the way, I just wanted to give credit where credit is due because I want people to know that neither Debbie Jones or I are here to fact check on Marisa Demaya giving her presentation because I think she knows more than both of us put
Oh
together
gosh,
about
yeah.
some of these subject matters. And so she invited us to be on here to offer observations and comment on stuff that we thought might be helpful to people. So just kind of mentioned that. And I'm not just saying that because Marissa's my younger sister, but hey, Um, but I wanted to mention that the truck driver case was great because it was the first time that that kind of an issue was taken up, taken into the public light and it got headlines and so on. And the court looking at which I think they did settle eventually. It didn't make it to the federal court or court of appeals, I think, but eventually the court did, indicate that they didn't see how it could be um, uh, an undue hardship on the operation of the business, which is the defense to decline an accommodation and then engage to try to figure out some other alternative accommodation. They didn't think that that was enough to call it undue hardship because the driver has to perform the driving function of driving the truck, and they didn't see how having the dog in the cab was going to interfere with that, and there were some concerns thrown out by the employer, um, the trucking company, in that they were saying, well, what if it gets in the way? If the dog gets in the way, what if it goes crazy inside the cab, it starts to bark or whatever, and they were thinking, yeah, that could possibly happen. I mean, that might be something, but service animals are, for metaphorically speaking, they're tethered to their owner. They stay with the owner, they rest with the owner, they sleep by the owner. The owner feeds the dog, waters the dog. It's not like they're going to start running around the cab and getting under the pedals or the gear shift, or this just seems so unlikely a scenario, right? Um, And when somebody brought up the issue of, well, suppose the truck has an accident, are we going to be liable for, the animal, getting hurt or possibly being killed in the process? And that brought up the issue that Marisa mentioned earlier about insurance coverage. Well, we don't, we can't allow the dog because of insurance policy, doesn't allow for that or would not cover that. And of course, the answer was, what, how was that any different than a person getting hurt or killed in a car crash? There's no difference. And so, they could have a passenger, a human passenger sitting on the other side of the cab. That's certainly not unusual. So, that was not enough, again, of an excuse to say we can't let the dog ride with you in the cab. And then to contrast that, you guys probably heard of another case, which last I checked, I think it had gone to the Court of Appeals, and I think the Court of Appeals finally said, no, we have to agree with the district court, which is, remember, the district courts, the federal district courts are just below the last resort court, which is the Federal Court of Appeals for a circuit. And of course, after that, it would go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court even takes the case. But the district court has said that in the case of a train engineer, a locomotive, a train driver, a locomotive engineer who wanted to bring his dog on board the engine, the locomotive engine, they said that that would not be a reasonable accommodation, and it would definitely be a cause for a direct threat. If not, and remember that in employment under Title I of the ADA, the defense of direct threat applies both ways. It applies to the employee, and it can also apply to the safety and risk of others, coworkers, or other people for that matter, like customers. And so they decided that that would be a tremendous risk to the dog. They were actually worried about the animal. And the reason is because the environment inside the cab of a locomotive engine is extremely noisy. The level of noise is really high to the extent that they have to wear ear protection when they're in there, or at least they're supposed to by regulation. And the vibrations, the electricity conductivity that takes place in these work environments are so risky and so dangerous to a human being, which is why they have to wear uniforms, they have to wear gloves. They are completely covered up when they're in there, which is why it's a very challenging and very rigorous job and very dangerous job to have. And so they say the dog just simply could not be in there. There would be no way to protect the dog from harm. And it wasn't that it would get in the way, it was just that it's just too risky. So in that sense, they said, no, your dog cannot be with you in the engine of the locomotive engine. Anyway, anything else? Hope that people are coming up some questions. Maybe not. I don't know, Marisa.
Diego,
Over
this
to
this
you.
is Debbie. I've actually been sort of pondering something. Thank you for talking about those two cases. That's so interesting. Where they can deny to,
Yeah, they really are
keep the
fascinating.
dog safe. They are fascinating. But Marissa, when you were talking about individuals making a request for their service animal as a reasonable accommodation, that to me says that maybe they acquired the service animal at some point during their employment, so that the service animal is
That's
kind of
true.
a new idea to the employer. But I found myself wondering about, what if someone who comes into an interview and they have their dog with them? Um,
That's a good one.
well, because at that point, the employer would know from the get-go that this person would need this accommodation. I guess it would kind of be like someone coming to an interview using a wheelchair or a mobility device. Do you have anything to say about how an employer is supposed to react to that?
Marissa, you want to say something on it?
I was going to say, Diego, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I love the topic of job interviews. I think Marissa and Debbie are both probably bored to tears with me talking about job interviews.
no, not
And
so.
job interviews are fascinating things because everybody tends to be so nervous when they go to a job interview. And I always tell people, oh, stop being nervous. You don't have the job yet. They haven't offered you the job yet. It's not one of those moments where you go, oh my goodness, what do I do now when they offer you the job, right? That's when you get nervous. It's when they offer you the job. Then you need to start getting nervous because now you're going to have to worry about going to work every day and meeting the responsibilities that you just promised you're going to deliver based on what you're going to get paid. But yeah, job interviews can be really fascinating because people have done all kinds of things in job interviews and coming to the job interview accompanied by their service animal. Oh, of course that's happened. It's happened, you know, many times. There's nothing new there. Blind people will bring their guide dog in, a hearing impaired or deaf person will bring their hearing dog in with them, you know, because it's part of their makeup, it's part of their who they are. It's part of their life and their disability. So and they don't mind showing to the public that they are an individual with a disability. But will it um, what's the word I want,
Fact,
Debbie? Will it shock or surprise? Um,
the interviewer
yeah, the recruiter, the person
or
doing
the
the interview.
employer.
I didn't want the word shock or surprise. What's the other word?
I would say impact.
Overwhelm
Okay.
or yeah, we can think of some of these adjectives,
Maybe
but
some kind of reaction.
yeah, and some people might actually become rather annoyed by it. I can say that because I myself am visually impaired and I've gone to job interviews and I could tell they were annoyed because I didn't have the courtesy of telling them beforehand that here I come with my white cane, because I'm visually impaired. And I'm being a little bit cynical and facetious about that, because under the ADA law, job interviewers cannot discriminate on the basis of disability. And one has to suppose that they certainly do not have any right to get annoyed or bothered because somebody shows up with a disability, you know, especially if it's an obvious disability. And they don't have a right to do that. If they're doing that, it's because they're being rude and unprofessional. Quite frankly, they're just being unprofessional. They're clearly showing their inexperience. Now, it may not be deliberate on their part. They might be legitimately afraid, overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? What do I ask this guy who comes in with a cane? Do I help him find a chair? Do I say something? You know, and by the way, I always have myself brought into a job interview either by a front desk person, um, or the interviewer themselves when they come to get you. I take their arm and they lead me in and they show me to the chair and everything is done and neat. No fuss, no mess, no tripping. And it takes off and off we go. But I am a very comfortable, experienced person. Many people may not be, like people coming out of college. They may be entirely uncomfortable dealing with their own disability and knowing how to handle it. We talk a lot to people. We do a lot of consulting and counseling with people that have no experience in how to handle their disabilities in certain situations. But if they bring in their service dog, yeah, they could be overwhelming the recruiter or the interviewer, and there's not much that any of us can do about it. Um, Hopefully, the situation will level out during the interview process. It'll become cordial and friendly and amicable. Um, I can see somebody asking the question, Debbie, right? Can I ask about the dog and the person's disability, right?
Right.
And
That was going to be my next question is
yeah, right. I
what
mean,
is it okay for an interviewer to ask the
yeah,
interviewee that has a dog?
yeah. And I think from my standpoint, first of all, let me say that anything goes in a job interview. Does that mean that it's legal for them to ask questions about disabilities? It is not.
No.
It is illegal under the ADA to ask about a person's disability, the nature of their disability, or any medically related information about the disability. Now, if the individual discloses the disability, then I'm afraid it just became an open door to ask questions. And what kind of questions can a recruiter ask?
Is it just the two questions?
Well, no, I mean about the dog, yes. Um, but also they can also add, maybe we can come up with a third question, right, guys? A third question being, how
There's a
will the
few.
dog help you with your essential job functions, right?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, I think that would become like a third question probably that we could tag on
Yeah.
to that bullet of two questions. Is it necessary because of a disability? What functions does the dog do for you? And then a third question could be, how will the dog help you with regards to doing your essential job functions of the position? Um, Remember that recruiters are allowed to ask, can you perform the essential job functions with or without a reasonable accommodation? The answer to that is always either a yes or a no. It is not asking for a disclosure of a disability. Please remember that, right? Remember that. It amazes me though, even today, how many years after the ADA? 32, I think.
34.
34.
34? Yeah.
34.
It amazes me how many people in recruiting who are experienced recruiters still never ask that question, or if they do, they think that it's about asking a person's disability and they botch it, you know? So, long story short, basically, if the person discloses having a disability and needing to be accompanied by their service dog, it is an open door. They can ask questions about limited questions about how the dog will allow you to perform your essential job functions. They cannot ask, why do you need the dog? What is your diagnosis? Do you have anxiety disorder, PTSD, or whatever it might be, if it's not blindness or if it's not because of a hearing impairment that the dog is needed? I think I'll leave it at that. I mean, eh, you know, regrettably, a lot of people will be taken aback and they get, honestly, some people have gotten, we've heard stories of people getting really angry. Well, you didn't tell me about your disability, and that's just, not fair. And and you're required to tell us about your disability before you even show up at the interview. It's all nonsense. There's no such legal obligation under the ADA. Nobody has to disclose any disabilities at all, not on the application forms they fill out online, not on their resume, and certainly not during a job interview, especially if it's a hidden disability, one that people cannot see. So just keep those little tips in mind there.
Yeah, that was a great comment because what this kind of all goes back to, it just makes me think of, we always tell folks, and this is a common question we get at the ADA Center that ties into this is, am I quote unquote lying? Or if I'm not mentioning that I have a disability when I go into the job interview, do I have to disclose to the employer that I have a disability? And it's not at all that you're lying. We always tell folks um, the only time you need to disclose a disability is when you need an accommodation.
And
And
when they've
that's,
offered you the job, right?
well,
Once
and
they
yeah,
offer you the job, right?
if you need an accommodation at
Mhm.
that point, then you can, decide whether or not to disclose a disability. Um, and I think that's a very important one because people will often, express to us that they feel like, well, I feel like I'm lying. No, that is not that is not the way to to think about it. It's only if the need arises.
Yeah. I wanted to, Marissa, do we have time for another comment?
We do. We have a few more
I
minutes.
wanted to kind of throw one at Debbie because she's more experienced than I am about emotional disorders and people that have kind of PTSD or anxiety disorders, learning disabilities, people on the autism spectrum. Debbie, I was wondering how might an employer handle, right, a request from someone that has that kind of disorder and they want to have a dog with them that helps them emotionally or with just plain companionship. You know, what kind of questions, I guess, could they ask in terms of performing, their their job?
Well, I think they would ask the same questions they would ask anybody that was asking for a service animal. How it's an interesting answer that they might get is, how will this animal help you perform your job functions? Someone that has an anxiety disorder or just a mood disorder in general, presumably one of the tasks that the animal does is help them stay on course,
Yeah,
however it is trained to do that, to put its head in their lap, or lean on them, or whatever it is that the animal does. The employer is going to be able to function better if the dog can help them stay on track, or can alert them that maybe an episode is coming on, and maybe can dig into the backpack and pull out
right. Okay.
the bottle of medication for them.
Yeah,
um, and I don't know that the individual needs to go into great detail,
right.
but enough to
Okay.
satisfy the employer that the dog is going to help them do their job, because they're going to be more steady. They're going to be able to stay on track. They're going to be maybe more self-aware because of the animal than they would be if they weren't allowed to have the dog.
Do you think that an employer might offer an alternative to the dog, to the service animal, in that regard with those kinds of disabilities? I mean, I'm not sure what might replace that.
I
You know?
don't know either. I mean, I have known about retirement communities, nursing homes that offer stuffed animals for people to hold on their laps. And, in the case
Wow.
of
Okay.
dementia or something like that, a little like a comfort toy sort of thing to help. But I don't know
Mhm.
that that would be equivalent for an employee. In fact, that might really hurt somebody's feelings, to say you can't have your well-trained dog with you, but here you can have this stuffed Snoopy. um I don't
Yeah,
know,
I see
Diego.
that.
I
Yeah.
don't
Maybe a
know
little
what
Yeah.
would be.
patronizing.
Yeah, I don't know what would be a good alternative for that. They'd have to have a really good reason why the dog wouldn't be appropriate in the
Yeah.
workplace. They'd have
Yeah.
to have a good defense, one of those good defenses that Marissa mentioned earlier.
Yeah, following that, I mean, I would think that I seem to always keep when we talk to HR people, I think, a lot of HR people are trying to do the best they can do and trying to do the right thing. And they call us, and they try to figure out, well, is there an alternative to this? And we have to tell them that when it comes to a service dog, that may not be appropriate. I mean, alternative, I mean, it would be like asking a blind person with a guide dog, like, well, what's the alternative? I mean, are you going to guide the person in and out of the building and through the office when they go get a cup of coffee or something? Obviously that would not be a replacement, would not be appropriate. You could say the same thing for a seizure detection dog, um, or a hearing impairment dog where the dog alerts the person when somebody's knocking on their door, or that there's somebody behind them asking them a question. So it's you know I think that's those are things just worth pointing out, that replacing a service dog with an alternative accommodation, which can and probably will come up during the interactive process, is something to watch out for and to be aware of, that they might ask questions like that. So
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to that, what appropriate maybe, but not best accommodation
Yeah, right.
that we talked about earlier. Again,
Yeah.
like Diego mentioned, it may not be the best accommodation. And that's really, we always tell folks, you've got to talk to the source. Somebody needs an accommodation. You really have to talk to that individual about what their needs are and
I
to
think it's
help make that
important.
determination.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that in terms of preferred or best accommodations versus appropriate accommodations, it's also worth pointing out that in many cases, the employer gets annoyed because there's a particular accommodation that actually works and lets the person do the job. And I think a service animal is a perfect example of that. It might bother them that they have this dog presence in the office or whatever the environment is, and they just get bothered by it. It's not because the dog is causing a nuisance or doing inappropriate things or the owner's doing inappropriate things. It's because they're just bothered by it. They're like, well, nobody else gets to have their dog, their pet at work, then why should you? And unfortunately, we deal with those kinds of reactions. I mean, like a lot. I just want people to know that these things do come up in that sense. And we try our best to stay neutral. We don't advocate versus one side or the other. Of course, we keep it confidential. And, whatever they tell us stays with us. If they want to yell and rant about, how unfair it is that this person comes in with their dog, well, they can yell and rant all they want to. But if they got it as a legitimate, reasonable accommodation, and that's the way things will be. We try to tell them that, look, stop complaining because you're going to be projecting yourself as being discriminatory or racist or something. And so you don't, how much trouble do you want in your life? So anyway, but that has come up sometimes, between best and appropriate and or preferred accommodations.
Great, great remarks here. Thank you so much to both of you, Debbie and Diego. I do want to, we have maybe 2 more minutes. Just a reminder to folks, if you didn't submit a question, we don't have any questions that were submitted, but if you do have more questions, you can always contact us. I'll put our 800 number again in the chat area and our email address. You can always email us. One comment I will make, going back to the original question, with regard to, emotional support animals or maybe therapy animals is, there's nothing in the ADA that says the employer can't allow it. Service animals are, recognized, right, as performing a task or service, but we have, and we're hearing more and more about employers getting requests from people to be allowed to bring their emotional support dog. That's a whole other can of worms that I've probably opened up right there with this, but I think we're probably going to have to stop here. But if you do have questions, again, shameless plug here, give us a call. That's what we're here for. Very quickly, we are at time, so I want to be respectful of folks. And again, thank you guys, both of you, Debbie and Diego, for joining me at lunch, and our audience for joining and sharing your lunch hour with us. We do have a study that we are actually working on. This is one of our projects at the ADA Center. It's a service animal and emotional support animal study. It's nationwide. This is an anonymous study, so no identifiable info is collected about the person or about participants or employers, but we are doing this study to talk to people about their experiences in either having their service dog or emotional support animal with them in the workplace. Feel free to contact us. I've thrown up the phone number there on the flyer. Our person who's working on that is Jocelyn Fajardo, and you can contact us if you would like more information. You can call 713-797-7171, or The email address is up there as well. I'll put it in the chat, but it'll also be included in this presentation, which we will be emailing you at the conclusion of today's program. So if you are interested, that information is up there and available to you, and you can always contact us. Again, here is our contact info. If you have more questions about this or other employment or other ADA related issues, we are happy to talk to you. You can call and talk to Debbie or Diego or me. Feel free. You can call 1-800-949-4232. All calls are confidential. Or also you can email us at swdbtac@ilru.org. And I've also put our web address up there too if you'd like to check out our website. I hope this has been a fun lunch hour for you guys. It certainly has been for us. I want to thank Debbie and Diego again for joining me and weighing in and participating in this great discussion and fueling more discussion. So again, thank you everybody. I'm going to go ahead and conclude our presentation and again say thank you for joining us and hope everybody has a great rest of your week.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.